trying to support athlete immunity? I mean, to start with, what are the factors that can actually start to lower or depress immunity, for an athlete?
Yeah, well, there's probably about 6 main factors that can depress immunity in an athlete. And of course, any depression of immunity can mean an increased susceptibility to infection if the actual exposure to pathogens in your environment remains about the same. So with the athletes, probably the biggest one is the impact of the exercise they're doing, performing prolonged, continuous training sessions, particularly if it's not with any nutrition taken on board, can depress immunity. And that effect is sort of amplified when the athletes do periods of intensified training where they kind of cut out the recovery days that might normally intersperse training days in their normal sort of microcycle. And that's when you start to get a real depression of immunity that you can measure kind of in the resting state, and it's still present at least 12 hours since the last exercise bout. So, it's sort of a progressive thing that's happening there. You get that with prolonged bouts of exercise and intensified training. But on top of that, you've also got psychological stress, which can also depress immunity. So worry, anxiety, depression, that can affect an athlete, the way results are going, how they're performing in training. Are they keeping their coach happy? Are they falling out with their teammates? There's lots of stresses in there, not to mention the monetary ones,
at home,
the ones from the media and things. So, a lot of pressure and stress, therefore, psychologically as well as physically. And then you've got that, and also the exercise they do can impact on their sleep quality and their sleep quantity. So if they're getting less than 7 hours sleep per night and their sleep efficiency is, say, less than about 90%, that's going to increase their risk of picking up infections as well by depressing their immunity. If they have to exercise in environmental extremes, that's an added stressor. So, exercising extremes of heat or cold or altitude in particular adds to the stress of the exercise. Also, if there's a lack of sunlight like there is now in the winter months in the northern hemisphere, it means probably vitamin D is going to be insufficient unless they're supplementing, which we recommend for all athletes. And on top of that, you've got long haul travel going across 3 or more time zones, disrupts sleep, disrupts your body clock, and that impacts on immunity negatively as well. And then nutrition, deficiencies of energy, protein, certain micronutrients, very important for immune function like iron, zinc, vitamin D, etc. Those all can cause, depressed immunity as well. So, kind of lots of different things that can impact on that. We used to put it all down to exercise at one point when it all, intensified training. But there's now a realization that all these other factors come in and can be related or caused by some of this extra exercise that they're doing when they're training really hard.
Yeah, it's interesting when we get to this time of year as well with sort of the modern schedules, compressed schedules. So of all the things you mentioned, more than likely for a lot of athletes, all of those things are happening with sort of lack of sleep, and we're traveling and training might be more intense or prolonged. We have, the stresses of obviously the team that you mentioned. We also have the stresses at home, and just, of course, the social media of things adding a layer of stressor. And so if we maybe start with the vitamin D side of things, where are we at now in terms of testing vitamin D levels? Is there a certain level that's going to provide the most protection, or up to a certain point that we're going to see protection in terms of immunity?
Yeah, well, vitamin D status is usually measured by taking a blood sample and measuring the concentration of 25 hydroxy in the blood serum. That's derived from what's being produced in the liver, where that first hydroxylation of the vitamin D precursor molecule takes place. And that seems to give us a good measure. The concentration of that in nanomoles per litre gives us a good measure of vitamin D status. You have different classifications of it. So if it's less than 30, that's deficient. If it's less than 50, it's considered inadequate. And somewhere above 50 and up to about 150 is the desirable range to be in. For bone, certainly 50 is considered the adequate value. For immune function, it seems it's probably somewhat higher. So probably in excess of 100 would be desirable, and at least 75. nothing below that really. And studies that have actually measured various markers of immune function in athletes, some of which we did ourselves. When I was working at Loughborough in the labs there, we found that the best protection for the athlete against picking up infections and against getting more severe, longer lasting symptoms when they did get infected was with above 120 nanomoles per litre. You don't want to go too high. You can only achieve that with regular exposure to sunlight or by taking vitamin D supplementation. And there is a limit that's suggested to be 4,000 international units per day. It's the maximum you should take to avoid going above 150 nanomoles per litre, which could potentially be harmful.
And is that why we potentially see more and more teams sort of heading off to warmer climates in the wintertime to, if we can only get to 4,000 IU really per day with supplementation, that's going to provide us some benefit, potentially going away for these small training camps to somewhere warm to be able to get that real exposure?
Well, I guess that helps, but you can achieve it just by supplementation.
Yeah,
and I mean probably 2,000 international units per day is what we recommend for an athlete. That will ensure that they have levels that are in excess of at least 75 nanomoles per litre of that metabolite. So that's good. I think the going to the training camp is just sort of perhaps a psychological boost, a change of scene, a bit of nice warm sunshine, making the players or the athletes feel good.
And so in your opinion, I know a lot of teams will kind of get hung up on if someone's at 80 nanomoles or 90 nanomoles, trying to push them up to past 90 or towards 120. And then they might decide to go, rather than 4,000 IU, let's do 8,000 or 10,000 IU. Would you be advising against that type of, we've seen some adverse data on some of the downstream metabolites there?
Yeah, there have been some papers that suggest that's not desirable from a health perspective, and that observations that have been made on people who don't take supplements but who are living in sunny environments, your vitamin D concentration, the 25-hydroxy vitamin D in the blood, never goes above 150 because we regulate it. And we stop producing vitamin D in the body when we get to that level. So that's more or less telling you the body doesn't want to go above about 150, so don't do it with supplements.
Yeah, great point. And what about for athletes, Black athletes, Hispanic athletes? The normal ranges that we see aren't necessarily, we don't have as much data on different populations, do we? So in your opinion, I know again, certain groups will have an athlete that has a level that's lower in terms of that quote unquote normal range, and they're really making big efforts to push that number up. And sometimes despite any real symptoms of the athlete, being immune depressed, catching colds and flus, struggling with any other sort of performance or recovery metric, but the fact that it is 20 or 25 nanomoles per liter in, let's say, a Black athlete, then that becomes more cause for concern. Could you maybe comment on what the body of knowledge is around the different ethnicities?
Well, certainly from the measurements I've seen on some professional soccer players, they have a whole mixture of races within their squads quite often. You can have Asian players, you can have Chinese players, as well as British players, European players, and players from Africa and the Caribbean as well. So yes, there's a whole mixture of skin colors in there, and the ones who are darker skinned, and particularly the Black players, do tend to always have lower vitamin D status when they're first measured before any supplementation is given. But they're treated in the same way as the rest of the squad, and they take exactly the same supplements, and it just seems to bring them up to the same level as everybody else. So I mean, there's no real need for any special considerations there, other than that if you've just signed a new player to your team and he's a Black guy, then you might want to test him for his vitamin D status and put him on supplementation if he's below 75.